Okay. Um, Basically, we spent a little time on relativistic views, and tried to show you some of the pros and cons. But with the view that we're going to look at next week, we sort of begin some non-relativistic views of ethics. Some views that try to say, well, we can talk and reason about ethical issues, notwithstanding what the subjectivists say. And also we can talk about some non-relative universal moral standards that hold across culture. And the first view we're going to look at next time is a view that some people don't even think is an ethical view, but it really is. It's called ethical egoism. And it basically is the view that the moral thing, the right thing for us to do, is to do what promotes our own best interest. In other words, that looking out for number one being ourselves, is the chief goal of morality. Now, obviously, not everyone thinks this. In fact, many people think that sometimes it is the antithesis of morality and we saw in that first chapter, Rachel says we have to have a certain amount of impartiality when we look at an ethical issue, that we want to look at things and as if we were an objective observer, and choose the right course of action simply based on what is right, and not based on what's going to help us or be in our best interest. But of course, this view of ethics, ethical egoism, if it's correct, we can't do that because it says that morality itself is basically following what's in my best interest. Now, this is obviously not a psychology course, and even though philosophers, the first psychologists were philosophers, and philosophers often get confused with psychologists. I guarantee you that happens. But we do have a psychological view here in Chapter 5. And you might say, well, why is that in there? I thought this was an ethics course, that we were looking at ethical theories and different perspectives on ethics. What is this, psychological egoism in it? Well, basically, it's a view that tries to give us a picture of of how humans are made, and it's not a modern psychological theory. This view, in its basics, was discussed as far back as Plato, in Plato's Republic, when it's one view that is considered and rejected, but nonetheless it's considered. And there's a rather strange story connected with it. I can remember way back in the 80s, I was teaching a course, an intro course, but also covering some ethics, and I was on the mailing list of some publishers, and I got an teacher's examination copy of an ethics text And it had this story from Plato in it about the ring of Gyges, Gyges. And I thought, you know what, this is very strange. Now, Rachel does not go into that story, but I'm just going to relate the basics because it's often read, or it's often included in ethics texts to illustrate this view of psychological egoism. Basically, Gyges is a shepherd, and he's one of the king's shepherds. And the view that's argued there is that we're all selfish, and we all would act in utterly selfish ways if we thought we could always get away with it. And the only thing that keeps us from acting in utterly selfish ways are societal constraints. That some of our behavior would be illegal, and we suffer, consequences. But the point of this strange story about the ring of Gyges is to illustrate what would happen if there were no consequences for our actions. So it tells the story of this king's shepherd, Gyges, is in a field, and there's a huge thunderstorm. And maybe also an earthquake, and the ground opens up. And there's this weird room with a figure, the body of a figure that Gyges says was obviously more than just a normal human being. So Gyges goes down there, and there are all kinds of some things surrounding this body. But what Gyges focuses on is a ring that the figure has, and he takes this ring off, and he surfaces. And this sounds like a story out of a sword and sorcery movie when you really read it, because he goes back to join his fellow shepherds, and he's kind of messing around with the ring while they're sitting around the fire talking, and then he turns the ring inside out, and all of a sudden his fellow shepherds are acting like he's not even there. And then he turns it the other way, and then they relate to him. And he experiments with this, and he learns that he has a magic ring that will make him invisible at will, depending on how he turns it. And so, realizing this, that some of you are in the business world, you have to do reports for your boss, how are things going. Well, the shepherds had to send a report back to the king on how well the flocks were going. And so Gyges, knowing what he now has, decides he finagles his way into being one of the messengers that takes the report of how the king's flock is doing back to the king. But then, using the powers of the magic ring, he seduces the queen. He kills the king, takes over half of the kingdom. And you can say, well, this was a really evil guy. Here's somebody who did all these things, But that's not the moral of this little story. See, the moral of this little story is, as the character goes on to explain, if you had two people, somebody who was a scoundrel and had a reputation for being, shady and who acts immorally, and then you take another person who has a reputation for being an honest, upstanding, very moral person, and the character in the dialogue says, you know what, if we gave one of these magic rings to both of them, he says, if somebody had this power, and there were no consequences for their actions because they could make themselves invisible at will, then he says, who would have enough strength of character that they would resist going into the marketplace and taking anything they wanted and going and seducing, neighbors' wives. In other words, the character in the story says, it's not that Dickus was an unusually evil guy. The view there is that we would all act that way if there weren't any external restraints to our actions. And this gets out this theory of psychological egoism, that basically the way we're constructed as human beings is that the only thing that really motivates us to do anything is if we see something in it for us. That the only thing that motivates us is self-interest. And that, at rock bottom, is psychological egoism. But now there's a story about Lincoln a little bit later, and of course Lincoln was the person who said you can fool some of the people all the time and all the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time, right? Well, there's a kind of parallel point I like to draw about psychological egoism, and if I had a video to capture, I'd put it on the board. But in order to understand this view and what you've read about it or what you will read about it, a lot of us know people who we think, he's a really selfish person. Mary acts really selfishly a lot. She's just always out for herself. And so some of us know people who would say, this person acts selfishly all the time. And most of us, if we're honest, we would say, well, you know what, there might be times when I thought that I was doing something for somebody else, but when I really thought about it, I realized that I was only acting in my own self-interest for what I could get out of it. In other words, most of us might say, there's some times when I act selfishly, right? Well, in order to understand this view of psychological egoism, you need to understand that it's a very extreme sort of view of human nature. It's not the view that there's just some people out there, like Mary, who act selfishly all the time. It isn't the view that some people act selfishly all the time. And it isn't the view that we all act selfishly some of the time. like most of us would admit, you know, you say, well, you know, hey, I kind of fooled people. People thought that what I did was really nice, but I really did it for myself. Neither one of those views is this extreme view of psychological egoism. But basically, psychological egoism says we all act selfishly all the time. In other words, that the only thing that motivates us is acting in our own interest, promoting our own self-interest. Now, if we define altruism as the view that would put the interests of somebody else above our interests, the point raised by this view is whether genuinely altruistic behavior is possible at all. Now we'll get to that. So that's psychological egoism, and I'm going to go through some of these slides real quick. I don't know. I don't think I made these up. Actually, these were originally part of a handout, and I did a detailed outline that I eventually put on PowerPoint. But so psychological egoism is not itself an ethical theory. Okay? Ethical egoism is. But psychological egoism is a very old psychological theory about human motives, about what makes us tick as human beings, right? And it holds basically, as I've already said, that the only thing that motivates us to do anything is if we see something in it for ourselves. That is, that human beings are motivated to action only through self-interest. And of course, the last point is the point I've already made, that it's not itself an ethical theory. Now, what you see in this slide is an argument that your text discusses on pages 67 and 68. And pointing out this feature is one way that people try to defend the view of psychological egoism. So you can kind of see this view. I call it in the slide here its main supporting argument. That's the way it was discussed in the text that I originally got up the presentation as a reference. I think it was the business ethics text I used. We always do what we want, but our wants are, after all, our wants. So, if we're always doing what we want, then, our wants, since they are our wants and desires, then our wants are always selfish. Therefore, we always act selfishly if we're always doing what we want. And, as I say, what this is a rational argument trying to convince somebody that this theory is a legitimate theory. And most of the time I don't have to convince students of this. But now there are some replies. One is that we don't always do what we want. And this point is made in your text. That often we might act out of duty contrary to our wants, just because we might think that we have a particular ethical duty, either to keep a promise or, to be benevolent to someone. And so one reply to this is that we don't always act according to our wants. And if we act from an obligation against our wants, then that seems to pose some problems for this claim that we're always acting selfish. Now, even if our wants or our desires are really our wants, that is, they reflect what we genuinely desire, it does not follow from this that all our wants are selfish. What we want or desire might be something like another's welfare or another's good. This point was made about 200 years ago by a bishop. I think it was a Protestant bishop whose last name was Butler, and he wrote at length against this view of psychological egoism. But I mean, other people in the Christian tradition, though, have thought, well, this theory sort of reflects the way a lot of people actually are. But the question is, can we act altruistically? And Butler tried to defend this. And what Butler said is, if you're trying to decide whether a want or a desire we have is selfish, you don't look at the fact that it's one of your own desires, one of your own wants. That's not what determines whether it's selfish or unselfish. But what Bishop Butler's point is if I say I want X or I desire X, here, X represents the object of my want or desire. Pardon? Okay. I mean, basically, if I say I desire X, X is the object of my desire. I desire an A in the choice. I desire a piece of chocolate cake. I desire, well, basically, what Bishop Butler's point is, and this is made in your text without crediting him for the point, is that what determines whether a want or a desire is selfish or unselfish, the way we find that out is to look at the object of the want, not the fact that it's my desire. So if the object of my want is the good of another person, then it's hard to see that want as a selfish want. and this is made kind of 3/4 of the way down page 68. The mere fact that you act on your own desires, for once, does not mean that you are looking out for yourself. It all depends on what you desire. If you care only about yourself and give no thought to others, then you are acting out of self-interest. But if you want other people, say, to be happy, and you act on that desire, then you aren't acting self-interest. In other words, if your desire is directed toward the good of another person, then Bishop Butler said, well, that type of desire I want is not a selfish or self-interested desire. So he said, just because our wants are ours, it doesn't follow from that they're necessarily selfish. Now, in order to understand why this is a consequence of this view, again, you have to go back to what I said, that this is not the view that some people act selfishly all the time. It's not the view that we all act selfishly some of the time. But it's the view that we all act selfishly all the time, and that's the only way we can act as human beings, that that's just the way we're put together. Well, if that's true, and a genuinely altruistic motive is a motive that puts the interests of somebody else above our own, well, if the only way we can act is from self-interested motives, then it seems to be a logical consequence of this view that we can't ever do anything from a genuinely altruistic motive. But you say, well, wait a second, though. I mean, people do things all the time for, other people's good, they donate, money to charity, they bake sales, parents, sacrifice for their children. You have people like Mother Teresa out there doing good deeds. We had Dee Gaddy in Baltimore. She died, but she, had this thing where it was a sort of ministry to people who were down and out or homeless. And we said, people doing altruistic things all the time. What about this? Well, this Lincoln story is an example of how psychological egoists respond to the claim that there seem to be examples of altruistic behavior out there. In other words, why don't we take them as falsifying the view that we're always acting selfish, as counterexamples that prove psychological egoism false? Well, the problem is you can always reinterpret people's motives. In other words, the psychological egoist can say, well, no matter what your motive seems to be, my theory says your motive had to be a self-interested motive. So no matter what it seems to be, your real motive must have been a selfish one, not an altruistic one. Pardon? Okay, I'm not familiar with the term. Yeah.
The same principle as guilty filters and
Right.
What's your reasoning off or something?
Right. No. Actually, that's a very good point. And this is a point raised against the psychological Egoism when they use this tactic. And that is, are you just arbitrarily rejecting any altruistic motive because your theory says there can never be altruistic motive, and rejecting them out of hand? Could you all read the Lincoln story here? We ought to read this. I was shocked that it was Lincoln who's defending this view. Anybody feel like reading some of this on page 69? It's indented. This is supposedly a real true story from a newspaper. Now, I thought he was on a train. I guess he was on a coach, more like a coach with horses. But it doesn't matter whether he had them stop a train or a coach. But what? Anybody want to read some of those? Yeah. So stop for a second. This seems to be an obviously altruistic act, right? Probably got his good suit dirty, what must not have been fun out there slogging in the mud. So it looks like this is an unselfish act. So go ahead and read the last few sentences. So how did Lincoln then reinterpret his motive to be a selfish motive? What was he really trying to do? Yeah, so he wouldn't feel bad, right? He'd feel bad if he just left the little piglets there in the mud. And so, in other words, wanting to feel good is, a sort of self-interested one, right? And so Lincoln is reinterpreting his motive as a self-interested one. And so if we help an old lady across the street, maybe we do it for some other motive. And basically, this strategy of reinterpreting motive can be done, and this is one reason why it makes it hard to give counterexamples to this view because you can always take any benefit that we might get from doing something, even if it's only a psychological benefit. I'm not going to feel bad this afternoon that I didn't help out in school picnic, right? Very often feeling of satisfaction. Well, we can always say, and this gets back to your comment about what was that phrase you used? Confirmation bias, right? In other words, these people are saying, well, look, if there was any benefit that you received out of it, I, the psychological egoist, am going to tell you that your real motive, no matter what you think your motive is, your real motive was to act to receive that benefit, hence to act from a self-interested motive. So if any benefit comes to us from doing something, the egoist, the psychological egoist can always say, well, that was why you did receive that particular benefit. And so so even if it were an intangible, like Lincoln, right? Lincoln says, well, okay, there wasn't the tangible benefit, but there was the intangible psychological benefit that I wouldn't feel bad the rest of the day, that it wouldn't help them. Often, if you helped the little old lady across the street and got a feeling of satisfaction, or you give the guy standing with the cardboard sign on the street corner $5, and you feel good about it, then then you could say, well, that was my motive, or the egoist could say that's your motive, to receive that satisfaction. But this makes the point, you can say, well, this really begs the question. In other words, it assumes what should be proven by the egoist. It begs the question in favor of psychological egoism, because it always assumes that our real motive is always the selfish motive. In other words, that's the length they have to go to defend the theory. And why must we assume this? And also, as Karl Popper once pointed out, if there doesn't seem to be a way that a theory can be falsified, in other words, if any possible counterexample turns out to be one that the theory can incorporate, then it may not be a scientific or an empirical theory after all, but may just be held on to, in spite of what the evidence requires. Now, see if you can understand this illustration. John Stuart Mill, we're going to see, did think we could act altruistically. He was one of the founders of a theory that we're going to spend quite a bit of time on later, utilitarianism, the view that we ought to act to promote the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And that may require acting against our self-interest. That may not be what's in our self-interest in given situations. May not be what's best for all concerned. So Mill did not like psychological egoism. And in Mill's day, in the 19th century, how did they find the Titanic? He said, look, my strategy what he did. He found things like coal that was never burned, and artifacts laying on the surface, and that the debris field was much larger than the ship, but the debris field led to the ship by following it. So in the 19th century and early 20th century, when the Titanic, a lot of the steamships burned coal. But what Mill said is, look, just because a steamship burns a certain amount of coal crossing the Atlantic, it doesn't mean that the reason it made the journey was just to burn the coal, right? And so his point was what? Even if we receive satisfaction from doing something good for somebody else, that does not mean that the reason we did it was to receive that feeling of satisfaction, or as Lincoln says, to make sure that we didn't feel bad the rest of the day. And this point is made in your text by saying that feeling like that can be a byproduct, but it's not, it's not the real motive that we did come for. So anyway, this was a point that Mill made in the 19th century against this view. So, if we receive a benefit from something we do, it does not follow that what motivated us to do it was to receive that particular benefit, even if it's only like the feeling of satisfaction. And here is a little deeper point. It's not really made in your text. Butler made it, and other people who discussed this make it. Think about it. Take something like what you guys right? Suppose people from your office decide, well, we're going to sacrifice and we're going to give up our Thanksgiving morning, and we're going to go down there and help prepare and serve lunch at these days. A lot more salt than we are. Right? Think about the person who really doesn't care very much about those people, but she or he is doing it because they want to show their team player, and they don't want to be thought poorly of for not going down there. But they're really not very concerned to help these people who they're going to be serving dinner. Think about it. Does that person receive much of a feeling of satisfaction? They're just kind of do it, Whereas, isn't it the person who really kind of feels some empathy for these people and say, they're for the grace of God go I. Isn't it that person? In other words, the person who really does care about somebody else, who's likely to get a feeling of satisfaction from helping them, and more likely to do so than somebody who doesn't care. Well, at any rate, this was Butler's point, that psychological egoism gets it the wrong way around. That it's not that we're doing it to receive satisfaction, but really the person who's most likely to receive satisfaction from doing something, like going down to Bee Gaddy's and serving Thanksgiving dinner, is somebody who's doing it from a non-selfish motive, who really cares about those people. And you just think about it. There are a lot of people who in Lincoln's situation wouldn't be bothered one bit if they saw the cow and the piglet in trouble. And why? Because they really don't care very much for them. Right? Okay, this now, down, this seems to be in a little trouble. Well, yeah, more important things to worry about than that, right? But no, I mean, in other words, somebody could argue against Lincoln that the reason he would feel bad if he didn't help them was because he genuinely cared for their good, and that he didn't act from such a selfish motive after all. In other words, that somebody who didn't really care for the good of those pigs and piglets, that person is not going to feel bad for them. Whereas Lincoln would have felt bad. Why? Because he genuinely cared for those animals, and so maybe his motive wasn't as self-interested as we thought. Well, these are the kinds of things that are usually discussed, but most people, and even Socrates and Plato thought that we could rise above, our tendencies that want to help ourselves and, do things just on principle or just because they're right. Well, this is the point that I made a little earlier, that it's not a strength of a theory that no possible empirical observation seems to falsify it. In other words, one of the things Karl Popper said is, if you want to really have a theory, try to figure out what would prove it false, and go out and try to prove it false rather than prove it true. He says, if you talk about pseudoscience and people who have false pseudoscientific theories, Popper says, look, they see confirmations of their views around every street corner. And now he's a young Marxist, so he uses Freudian psychology and he uses Marxism as an example. You say, in center of a Marxist point of view, he sees confirmation of his views on class struggle and exploitation everywhere. But Popper said the real strength of a real scientific theory is what events in the world would have to happen that would prove this theory false. I mean, if I have a theory that, we have these theories about this comet. Somebody says it's going to be one of the brightest objects in the sky. Now people are thinking this thing might be breaking up in the sun and it's not going to be. Well, you could tell a story about what would confirm or deny it. I mean, is there water on Mars? Well, we could tell stories about how we could confirm or disconfirm that. So what Popper said is, if no possible observation seems to falsify a theory, that may show that it's just a piece of pseudoscience, and not a really empirically testable theory. That is a testable theory by observation methods and real and scientific methods, and maybe should be rejected as a piece of pseudoscience held on to in spite of any possible evidence. And this is a lot of people's suspicion about psychological egoism that it's held on to by its proponents, and they'll accept no possible counter for disproving the theory. But that's not a good thing for a theory. And there are some examples that you really have to go a long way to think of them as selfish. There was somebody who recently was given the Medal of Honor posthumously. He's up in one of these Humvees or half tracks by, lookout by the machine gun. 3 of his buddies are inside, and there's like an open door. And as they go by, sort of, I guess, Afghan resistance throws a hand grenade into the Humvee. And so his buddies are just kind of frozen with fear and sort of coward ways. And he knows if this hand grenade goes off, it can kill all 3 of them. He's the only one of the 4 who's in a position to save himself. He's up there. He's not trapped down in the compartment of that vehicle. And what does he do? Well, he jumps down into the vehicle while his buddies are sort of cowering and jumps on top of the hand grenade and gives up his own life to save them. Well, you can say, well, he really did it because he was hoping to, be honored as a hero. But, it's a possible way of reinterpreting his motives. But most people who do heroic acts like that say the last thing I was thinking about is getting some kind of a reward for what I did. I was just thinking of what I needed to do to get the job done. So at any rate, an action like that is you have to really go pretty far to interpret that as a selfish act. Well, and we're not going to get into this, but one of the things that allows the psychological egoist, of course, to go on and maintain the theory is that motives aren't open to public observation. And because of that, it is a theory that can be held on to by its advocates. So we'll look at ethical egoism, but it's in the slide, and if it's the next slide, I'll mention it. If it's not, yeah. This is why we relate this to, and this is the last point we made. There's a cliche that says ought implies can. In other words, it can't be our moral duty to do what's impossible, to do the impossible. So if there's something I ought to do, it better also be something I can do. Right? Well, if ought implies can, remember, psychological egoism says the only thing I can do, because of the way human beings are put together, is act from self-interested motives, from selfish motives. So if psychological egoism is right, and that's the only thing I can do, well, why shouldn't that be the only thing I ought to do? So why shouldn't morality simply be pursuing my own self-interest? And ethical egoism is, as we'll see next time, a moral theory that says the moral thing for me to do always is to pursue my own self-interest. Now, it's not subjective. It's not the theory that however I interpret right and wrong, is okay for me, and if you interpret it differently, that's okay for you. This is a theory that claims to give us the truth about morality. And the truth about morality, the non-relative truth, is that the moral thing to do is to act in a sense. But this is why we look at this view of psychological egoism, because if it's true, and the only thing we can do is act in our own self-interest, then why shouldn't that be the only thing we're morally required to do? And why shouldn't we then accept the ethical theory, ethical egoism, on the premise that psychological egoism is true and we can't act in other ways anyway? So that's how the two of them get connected together. The psychological theory is given as a view to hold the ethical theory. So we'll look at that next time. Look, thanks a lot for staying. I'm sure it must have been a long day.